Okay, guys, I ended that last one rather abruptly. I couldn't find the off switch. I was looking for a mouse. Never mind. Point is, screw it. But that's okay. Anyway, point is this. So we continue with the French Revolution. We're in 1792. Look, Maximilian, the Jacobins are running France. Louis is sitting in prison. And the other nations of Europe are all looking at what's happening in France. Some nations, England, Portugal, a little more moderate nations, are looking at France and go, well, these are the ideals of the revolution, of the Enlightenment. We kind of like these ideas. They're kind of cool. Other nations, more conservative nations, are looking at this and seeing a problem. If the ideals of the French Revolution were to continue, if they were to grow, they certainly could be exported to their own countries, and then we would have true problems. So in April 1792, certainly I'm trying to get rid of that light there, two of the most conservative nations of Europe, Austria and Prussia, April 1792, they signed something called the Pillnitz Agreement. Now, Pillnitz Agreement says that we will do whatever's necessary, essentially, to get rid of the French Revolution, including war. They don't actually invade, but the threat is there. Robespierre uses this as an opportunity to rally the French public, to get them going and say, look, we're a threat, there's war, and instead of waiting for war to occur, he decides to declare war on Austria and Prussia. The best defense is good offense. That way, trying to appeal to the national spirit of France, keep the revolution going, keep a change coming, avoid any kind of backlash or a movement, as often happens in revolution, where people begin to slow down. They want to continue the revolution. So now France is at war, 1792. In January 1793, Max makes a very important decision. He decides to, 21st of January 1793, he decides to execute Louis. He sends Louis to the guillotine. While moderate nations had looked at this with some sympathy, the revolution, the execution of Louis turns them against France. The idea that the French have gone this far to actually execute royalty, after all these other nations, nations have royalty. This is too much. So now France in 1793 finds itself at war with everyone. Robespierre becomes more and more paranoid. And as his paranoia grows, he begins to look for spies. He begins to look for enemies. And of course, the place where he's going to look for those enemies is going to be amongst the French aristocracy and the church. You begin to see the arrest, the trial, and almost inevitably the execution by guillotine of one French aristocrat or French member, church member after another. As an example, in September of 1793, it said they executed 3,000 people. That works out to about 100 a day, and that's with trials. They were executing priests, the aristocracy. By the summer of 1794, France has become more and more paranoid, more and more concerned about invasion, and the killings begin to increase. Again, it's thought that maybe 40,000 Frenchmen and women had died because of Robespierre's policies. By the summer of 1795, there's been no invasion of France. Paris has remained secure. And the French public begins to go through a bit of a transformation. You do something as a society, and then when you begin to realize what you've done, all these dead people, the guillotines, the hysteria, you want to do something about it. Certainly you want to stop it, but you need to use a modern term, closure. You need to say, we need to blame somebody. Somebody caused this. And you can't just blame all of us. And that doesn't give you closure. Somebody is to blame for this. We do this all the time, guys. We have problems in the Middle East. It's Osama bin Laden. Get rid of him. We need a face. All right? That face is going to be Maximilien Robespierre. People of Paris turn on him. July 1795, somewhat ironically, Robespierre is sent to the guillotine. Now we enter a new stage in the French Revolution, and that stage involves Napoleon Bonaparte. Very quickly, guys, Napoleon Bonaparte was born in 1769 on the island of Corsica. Corsica had been independent just a few years prior to his birth. And in fact, he and his family had been strong Corsican nationalists. Corsica is off the west coast of Italy. And in that fact, as a boy, he had fought against the French. But very soon it became clear that the Corsicans were too small in number and too little in power to fight France. And his father saw this very quickly and decided that it was time to change sides, and he became French. He sent his son, Napoleon, to French military school, and Napoleon learned not only military craft, but also to be French. It's said he always resented this to some degree. He certainly was not happy at school, but he was a very good student. He moved into the French military. He became an officer, and when the French Revolution broke out in 1789, Napoleon remained loyal to the Republic. He joined the Republic and remained part of the Republic, and he remained loyal to the Republic. Now, under the Jacobins, under Maximilian. Now, it is said that, yes, certainly Napoleon had many military skills, but he was also, and he also believed in some of the ideals of the revolution, but he was also ambitious. And as the French military were leaving France, positions began to open up, especially for somebody who was as skilled as Napoleon Bonaparte. By 1795, when Maximilian is sent to the guillotine, Napoleon has become one of the most important military leaders in France. And the Third Estate find themselves in a real problem. They've got a French public that's tired of revolution, and tired of the violence, and certainly tired of a rule that occurred under Robespierre. You're beginning to see a kind of back movement. They're backing off a little bit, thinking maybe we had enough of the revolution. And on top of that, there hasn't been an election in France since 1789. I mean, we've been talking about revolutionary ideas and equality, but the same guys who had been members of the Third Estate in 1789 are still there in 1795, and they've been living a pretty good life. They've had the best of food, the best of positions. So they're afraid of losing that position. And they put together a deal, a deal with the military. The military will make sure that the members of the Third Estate stay in power. Is it still a revolution? Well, the revolution's continuing, but clearly the leaders are not the revolutionaries they once were. Napoleon Bonaparte now is playing a very important role. He is controlling rising royalist and anti-Third Estaters, anti-Republicans. A lot of people coming up now and saying we've had enough of this, we want something different. And as I said, even going back to Louis. In 1796, Napoleon Bonaparte is able to control these rioters and those who oppose the Third Estate. He's become extremely popular, not just for people who support the Third Estate, but even his own enemies have to acknowledge that the guy, is true. The guy is able to solve the problems. The guy uses force, but he doesn't use too much force. Yes, he is the first general that we know of that used cannon against the Paris mob. But on the other hand, he does seem to be competent. By 1796, the Third Estate have got themselves a problem. The military is making sure they stay in power, but if you have somebody like Napoleon in Paris who's that popular, he could very quickly or easily overthrow the government. So they got to do something. They can't demote him. He's a popular guy. So what do? You send him away. They send him to northern Italy to fight in what's known as the Italian Campaign, 1796. In the Italian Campaign, Napoleon will fight 6 major battles. In each one of these battles, he will be outnumbered. In each one of these battles, he will be victorious. He's so popular now, he's becoming legendary. The French government send him awards, send him promotions, but they don't want him to come home to Paris. So they send him to Egypt. In Egypt, he fights primarily against the Egyptians and the British, who were allies. And he wins. But now he begins to hear, 1797, 98, he begins to hear that there's going to be a military coup in France, which is fine with him. The problem is he's not there to lead it. He does something that even Napoleonic apologists have a difficulty dealing with. He deserts his army in Egypt. He sneaks off, gets back to France, gets back to Paris. His army essentially dies off in Egypt. But once he gets back in Paris, he meets Abbé Sieyès, that old guy, remember? Abbé Sieyès, what is the Third Estate? And together they are able to take control of the French government. 1801, Napoleon Bonaparte now rules France. He is essentially a military dictator. He uses an old Roman title called consul, C-O-N-S-U-L, but essentially he's a military dictator. For a few years, France has peace. 1801, 1803, there's a lull in what are known as the Napoleonic Wars. But in 1803, war breaks out again. Now, I'm not big on military history, guys, and there are plenty of people who do it much better than me, but suffice it to say this. Over the next few years, it becomes clear. When it comes to land, Napoleon appears to be unbeatable. He beats everybody. But when it comes to the seas, it's the British. And this is made clear in 1805, something called the Battle of Trafalgar. Battle of Trafalgar, led, of course, by Horatio Nelson, the great British naval hero. At the Battle of Trafalgar, Horatio Nelson destroys the French fleet, and heroically, and of course almost has to be, he dies at the battle. If you've ever been to London, guys, you've probably been and seen Nelson's column in Trafalgar Square. Battle of Trafalgar essentially gives Britain control of the seas, but France remains all-powerful on land. Just to mention one very important battle on land. In 1807, France fought against Russia. And Russia led by Alexander, the Tsar Alexander, 1807. After the battle, they had a meeting, which is the point I want to emphasize, not the battle itself, something called the Tilsit meeting. The Tilsit meeting said that essentially Western Europe belonged to Napoleon. But when it came to Eastern Europe, that was Russia's. Now, why would Napoleon say something like this? Well, Napoleon said a lot of these things. You know, he sold most of North America after conquering Spain to the United States and Louisiana Purchase in 1803 for a pittance. Why? Well, he figured he'd always take it back. Right? He was always telling people you can have that, but he always figured he'd take it back. He's telling Alexander, Eastern Europe is yours. I don't want to deal with it because he doesn't want to deal with it now. He's got other issues. Primarily, he's got Britain to deal with. That's the only nation that really stands against him in 1807. So, at the Tilsit meeting, Alexander is told, you can do what you want in Eastern Europe. However, when it comes to Western Europe, you have to do what I tell you to do. Simple as that. Problem with that, guys, is Russia's major trading partner in the world in 1807 is Britain and the British Empire. If Alexander were to agree to this, it would destroy his economy. Result being that over the next few years, while Alexander says he's obeying the Tilsit meeting, he's really not. He's allowing trade to go on. And Napoleon becomes more and more angry. By 1812, Napoleon decides to punish Alexander. He sets off on a punitive expedition, the invasion of Russia in 1812. Summer of 1812, he takes off. Things are going well, as they usually do when people invade Russia. And I always make the joke that now we know that God is Russian because every time anybody tries to invade them, whether it's the Poles or the Germans or the French, it's always the worst winter in Russian history. And it turns out that, in fact, it is a very, very bad winter. But Napoleon has success. He gets to Moscow. He's supposed to conquer the capital, as you do, get the ruler in a room, say some nasty words to him and say, don't do this stuff anymore. The ruler, Alexander, will say yes, and then you go home. Alexander doesn't play by the rules. Alexander leaves. He leaves Moscow. Now Napoleon's sitting there. He's got a huge army of over 600,000 men. He's surrounded by millions of Russians. Winter is setting in. It's getting colder and colder, and there's no Alexander. So Napoleon decides he's got to get out. 1812, in 1812, 1813, he's going to go back to France. Forget this. As he begins to retreat back to France, the Russian army appears. The Russian army splits essentially in half, in the front and the back of the French army. As they make their retreat, the Russians don't fight them head on. Instead, they destroy everything that the French can use: water, food, shelter. The other part of the Russian army deals with stragglers. By the time Napoleon has gotten to Germany, he has maybe 100,000 men left. 100,000 troops left. In 1813, he fights what's known as the Battle of Nations. Russia and Austria have caught up to him. They have been joined by other nations. And at the Battle of Nations in 1813, Napoleon loses. But he manages to get back to Paris. He escapes. Unfortunately for him, all of his enemies also follow him, and he's captured. In 1814, he is sent to the island of Elba, E-L-B-A, there to be imprisoned. Well, it's not really a prison. He's actually supposed to run the island. He's supposed to get a pension. And it's not that bad of a setup. Obviously, the victors don't know what to do with Napoleon Bonaparte. You can't kill him. He becomes a martyr. So they put him on this island. Figure he'll live there and stay out of the way. Napoleon lasts for a few months. He's never paid the pension. He's unhappy. He's bored. He's told that the French public wants him back. In 1814, he escapes Elba. He goes back to France temporarily. Rules again from Paris, has much of the military is supporting him, and he sends out a letter to his former enemies saying, "No more war. I'm tired. I'm retired. I don't want to do this anymore." Nobody believes him. They begin to build an army in Belgium. Napoleon knows this. The question is, do you attack this army while it's building and before it becomes full, or do you wait, build up your own defenses, and wait for the invasion? If he attacks now, he's not really ready, but he doesn't want to wait until they're ready, if that makes sense. So in July of 1815, he decides to attack. He attacks the Allies at Waterloo, July 1815. The Allies are led by a British field marshal named Wellington, and at the Battle of Waterloo, Napoleon loses. Napoleon is now sent to the island of St. Helena, where he will live out the rest of his life. The French Revolution is significant for many things, guys, not only because it brought many of the ideals of liberty and equality and of the Enlightenment to France, but the French military, perhaps not on purpose, but wherever they went, they brought the ideals of the French Revolution. And you will see those seeds planted all over Europe. In the 19th century, you will see liberal revolutions break out. Russia, Poland, many places, Italy, throughout Europe. Some successful, some failures, but those ideals are planted by the French, and they are planted there because of Napoleon Bonaparte. All right, guys, bye-bye.